June 1945, southern Okinawa. The rain hasn't stopped for days. Gray smoke drifts over shattered cliffs where field hospitals once hid in limestone caves. Inside one, the air is thick with the smell of iodine, mud, and fear. A line of young Japanese nurses, barefoot, uniforms torn and blood-stained, step slowly into the open, hands trembling above their heads. They've been told what would happen if captured. They've heard stories of mutilation, humiliation, execution. None of them expect to see another sunrise. Across the clearing, a squad of U.S. Marines watches in silence. The youngest corpsman lowers his carbine. He motions for them to stop, kneels, and opens a battered pouch. Out comes a canteen, then a small brown-wrapped bar, hard, waxy, and almost melted from the heat. He breaks it and holds out a piece. The nurses hesitate. Then one steps forward, takes it, and bursts into tears. That small gesture, a rationed piece of chocolate on a battlefield of despair, will travel further than any bullet fired that day. It will challenge years of fear, propaganda, and hatred on both sides. By mid-1944, Japan's empire was shrinking. The battles that once brought headlines of conquest now returned only silence and loss. In every corner of the home islands, the government prepared its people for invasion. Schools became barracks. Hospitals became fortresses, and young women, many still teenagers, were mobilized as nurses for the Army and Navy. They were trained quickly, often brutally. Instructors told them that the greatest honor was to die alongside the wounded. Never surrender, they were warned. The enemy will torture you. Those words were not metaphor. Since the beginning of the Pacific War, propaganda had carved the image of the American soldier into something less than human. Leaflets, school lectures, even medical manuals reinforced it. Capture meant defilement or death. For thousands of Japanese nurses, this became unquestioned truth. On the islands of the Pacific, the system hardened. By 1944, the Army Nurse Corps and auxiliary student nurse groups had been assigned to every major garrison, from Saipan to Okinawa. They treated not only soldiers but civilians caught in the bombing and starvation that now defined Japan's outer defenses. Their world was underground. Cave hospitals dug into coral hillsides lit by candles, stocked with dwindling morphine and water. The wounded lay in rows, whispering prayers as naval bombardment shook the rock overhead. When the Americans landed on Saipan in June 1944, those caves became tombs. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers and medical staff chose suicide over surrender. Nurses injected air into their veins, or used grenades meant for patients. Many were convinced that capture would mean unspeakable violation. Yet in the chaos, a few survived. The first recorded surrenders of Japanese medical staff occurred near Charon Kanoa and Marpi Point. Marines advancing through the hills discovered small groups of women waving white cloth. They were terrified, certain they'd be executed. Instead, they were given water, cigarettes, field rations, and chocolate. Corpsmen and MPs followed standing orders: treat all wounded regardless of uniform. These interactions, often unreported, were the first cracks in the wall of myth. Still, the broader system of fear held. On Tinian, the next island in the Marianas chain, thousands of civilians jumped from cliffs after hearing broadcast rumors that Americans would enslave them. The Imperial Army had made sure no one would expect mercy. Even captured soldiers, once interrogated, repeated what they had been told since childhood: better to die than to be shamed. For the Americans, the shock of Saipan changed policy. Commanders realized that firepower alone could not win the next phase of the war. They had to fight misinformation. Psychological warfare units began producing leaflets promising humane treatment for those who surrendered. Loudspeakers carried messages in Japanese: "You will not be harmed. Lay down your weapons," and frontline medics learned a simpler truth: food and water could do more than propaganda ever would. Among the most recognizable symbols of that truth was the USD ration chocolate bar. Created in 1937 by the Hershey Company, it was dense, bitter, and heat-resistant, intended as emergency fuel. Each weighed about 4 ounces and contained over 600 calories. Soldiers joked about its taste, but to starving civilians it was miraculous. On Saipan, Guam, and Leyte, Marines began sharing it with captured nurses and civilians as a first gesture of reassurance. Japanese diaries later described these encounters with disbelief. "They gave us candy," one nurse wrote, "and said we would live." It contradicted everything they had been taught. When the U.S. prepared to invade Okinawa in early 1945, both sides remembered Saipan. The Americans refined their humanitarian and intelligence strategy. The Japanese strengthened their indoctrination. Civilians and medical staff were told again, "Americans will kill you all." Pamphlets distributed in Okinawan schools urged women to keep one last grenade for themselves. Yet U.S. commanders, aware of the tragedy of mass suicides, added new orders. Encourage surrender, protect non-combatants, and show compassion whenever possible. By the spring of 1945, the stage was set for the bloodiest battle of the Pacific and for one of its quietest moments of humanity. Beneath the artillery and flame there would be caves, nurses, and an exchange of kindness that no one had planned. The lessons of Saipan had shaped both fear and mercy, and both would meet in the hills of Okinawa. The invasion of Okinawa began on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday. For the U.S. 10th Army, it was the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. More than 500,000 men would rotate through the island before it was over. To American commanders, Okinawa was a rehearsal for the invasion of Japan itself. To the Japanese, it was the final line of defense before the home islands. Hidden beneath the ridges of the south, the Japanese 32nd Army had transformed the terrain into a vast defensive network of tunnels, caves, and concrete bunkers. Among the soldiers were hundreds of Army nurses, student nurses, and volunteer corps women, most barely out of high school. They were attached to field hospitals known as Haigo Byoen, literally, hospitals in the rear, though in truth there was no rear left. They worked in constant darkness, kneeling beside wounded men as maggots crawled through the bandages. Outside, the U.S. forces advanced with overwhelming artillery and air power. Entire villages were erased. Yet the Americans had learned from the chaos of Saipan and Leyte. Each division carried civil affairs detachments, trained to handle civilians and prisoners. They established refugee collection points, secured areas behind the lines where non-combatants could receive food, water, and medical care. These zones became vital when terrified Okinawans began emerging from caves and ravines. A new component of this system was the medical triage line. As civilians were captured or surrendered, medics were ordered to separate the wounded, disinfect injuries, and distribute emergency rations. Most rations came from the C ration and K ration packs, small tins of meat, biscuits, powdered drink, and again a chocolate bar. A single D ration bar, designed to withstand tropical heat, could survive days in a pocket. It became the easiest symbol of safety, a soldier kneeling, offering chocolate instead of a rifle. Many accounts from Okinawa describe this moment. Some from U.S. units, some from Japanese survivors. A Marine officer from the 1st Division wrote in his log, "A young woman came out waving a white cloth. She was crying, holding her arm as if shot. My corpsman went forward and gave her water, then one of those awful chocolate bars. She fell to her knees." The nurses on the Japanese side had been taught that capture meant dishonor, but starvation and exhaustion had changed everything. The last organized hospitals in the south, like the Haibaru Army Hospital, were overrun in June. Witnesses recalled American medics giving the surviving nurses and civilians chocolate and canned food before escorting them to collection camps. To the Americans, this was procedure, humanitarian treatment of prisoners, mandated by field orders in the Geneva tradition. But to the women who had lived in darkness, it felt like an impossible mercy. Behind this policy lay months of planning. The U.S. Psychological Warfare Branch had produced tens of thousands of surrender leaflets before the landings, promising fair treatment. Radio Okinawa broadcast in Japanese, "We will treat you kindly. Come forward peacefully." In Saipan and Leyte, these messages had already proven their worth. Every civilian who surrendered peacefully was evidence that American words were true. Chocolate, water, and cigarettes became more than supplies. They became tools of psychological warfare. Field commanders noted that a small act of kindness could open floodgates of intelligence. Civilians and nurses, once reassured, began describing tunnel systems, casualty numbers, and the condition of Japanese forces. Humanity, in these brief exchanges, served strategy. By June, the battle's end was visible. The Japanese high command on Okinawa was destroyed. General Ushijima committed suicide on June 22nd. What remained were the wounded, the medical staff, and civilians wandering through mud and ruin. In that twilight of defeat, hundreds of Japanese nurses surrendered to U.S. troops. They were given blankets, bandages, and rations. For many, it was their first real food in weeks. Later testimonies would recall that same image, a Marine or corpsman, silent, reaching into a pouch handing out something sweet. For the survivors, the taste of chocolate, bitter, foreign, and warm from a soldier's hand, became the moment they realized they would live. The battlefield had changed from annihilation to occupation, from total fear to the fragile beginning of peace. But that transition was not an accident. It was the product of deliberate doctrine and the shared fatigue of two exhausted nations. Now, as the last caves fell silent and the island turned to ash, those encounters became lessons. Lessons carried forward to Japan itself and remembered by generations who once believed mercy was impossible. 1. Human angle. The moment. Mercy replaced fear. For the Japanese nurses, the war had been a descent into darkness. Many were conscripted students, barely trained, barely fed, living in caves with the wounded. Their hands were raw from scrubbing infected wounds with seawater. The only light came from candles or shell fire. By the final weeks on Okinawa, they no longer expected to survive. Some had even been given grenades for honor. When the Americans reached their positions, the first reaction was disbelief. Nurses covered their faces, expecting humiliation or worse. Instead, they heard the one thing they hadn't expected. Silence. No shouting. No gunfire. Just a medic kneeling in the mud. He spoke softly, gesturing for them to sit, and handed out chocolate bars from his pocket. The nurses didn't understand the words, but they understood the gesture. The terror that had ruled their lives began to crack. In diaries and oral testimonies decades later, many remembered not the moment of capture, but the moment of kindness. A taste, sweet, strange, and unreal, became proof that they were still human. That contrast between propaganda and reality was one of the quietest psychological victories of the entire Pacific War. Tactical angle, humanitarian acts, as IKEA's military tools to American field officers, mercy wasn't sentiment, it was strategy. By 1944, the U.S. military understood that surrender rates depended on trust. Every act of kindness on Saipan, Tinian, or Okinawa reduced the number of suicides and increased intelligence yields. Chocolate, water, and medical treatment were as much tools of war as rifles and radios. On Okinawa, the 10th Army's Civil Affairs Division coordinated daily with combat units. Each regiment had designated POW handling teams, medical detachments, and psychological warfare liaisons. When non-combatants emerged from caves, the first contact was carefully staged, a medic without a weapon, food visibly offered, translators present where possible. The message was deliberate. Surrender was survival. Japanese nurses, once captured, often revealed critical information, where the wounded were hidden, which caves still contained soldiers, which hospitals held supplies. In this way, compassion directly shortened battles and saved lives on both sides. It was tactical empathy, an idea rare in modern warfare but highly effective in the Pacific's closing months. Technological byteswats. Medical angle, the rations and remedies of war. The American Field Medic's kit in 1945 was a paradox of brutality and care. Inside his satchel, sulfa powder, morphine syrettes, plasma bottles, tourniquets, and usually a small C ration or D ration bar. The D ration, invented years earlier by the U.S. Quartermaster Corps, was intentionally hard to eat. It had to withstand 120 D, resist melting, and deliver instant calories. Soldiers complained that it tasted like sweet sandpaper, but it didn't spoil. To the starving civilians and nurses of Okinawa, that bar was gold. It provided energy to walk, to think, to live. It also served another purpose. Sharing food symbolized peace. In military psychology manuals circulated later in 1945, instructors noted that the offer of a ration may precede verbal communication in calming hostile or frightened persons. Meanwhile, the captured Japanese nurses were often astonished by American medical treatment. Wounded prisoners received blood plasma, sulfa, and penicillin, drugs that Japan could no longer produce in quantity. For many, it was their first time seeing modern antibiotics. The same soldiers they had been taught to fear were now saving their lives. These human, tactical, and technological angles together reveal the pattern behind the headline. What began as isolated gestures, water, rations, chocolate, grew into a deliberate system of battlefield compassion, honed through experience and necessity. But beneath procedure and policy, individual choices still defined everything. It took one soldier to lower his weapon, one medic to extend his hand, one nurse to accept it. Their decisions would ripple outward, reshaping how both nations remembered each other after the war. Or leadership angle, orders that encouraged humanity. The compassion that reached those Japanese nurses was not accidental. It was written into American field orders, lines buried among operational details about terrain and supply. In April 1945, the 10th Army Command under Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., issued directives on the treatment of civilians and medical staff. These orders instructed every unit: respect medical personnel and the wounded, aid the helpless, prevent unnecessary loss of life. Such policies were unusual in a war so fierce. They reflected lessons learned on Saipan and Leyte, where mass suicides had horrified even battle-hardened troops. Commanders realized that psychological warfare wasn't only about loudspeakers and leaflets, it was about behavior. Soldiers were briefed that small acts of mercy could serve the mission more than another grenade. In field hospitals and collection points, senior medics enforced those principles strictly. Any cruelty was punished, any kindness noted in reports. Commanders like Major General Roy Geiger of the Marine III Amphibious Corps encouraged the humane approach because it preserved order. When frightened civilians saw wounded Americans treated beside Japanese, chaos subsided. It turned the battlefield into a fragile space of civility amid total destruction. Enemy mindset angle, indoctrination, meets reality. For decades before the war, Japan's education system had fused nationalism with moral terror. From childhood, students learned that surrender was worse than death. Teachers spoke of the 47 Ronin and the Bushido Code. The imperial rescript on education demanded loyalty unto the grave. By 1945, those ideals had been twisted into state dogma. Women who fell into enemy hands were dishonored. Men who surrendered shamed their ancestors. Nurses were no exception. Military training manuals explicitly warned them that Americans butcher captives and violate women. When told to evacuate the wounded, many chose instead to die beside them. On Saipan, entire groups of nurses injected morphine into each other's arms rather than surrender. But propaganda is fragile when confronted by reality. The first captured nurses to survive captivity returned home after 1945 and spoke of what they'd seen. Americans sharing chocolate, treating wounds, weeping over dead children. Their testimony conflicted with everything the Japanese military had preached. One Okinawan nurse later wrote, "I believed I would be killed. They gave me food. I could not understand. I cried because I had lived." That cognitive collapse, the moment fear dissolved into confusion, then gratitude, marked one of the quiet psychological victories of the war. It didn't appear in headlines, but it eroded the foundations of a regime built on lies. 6. Moral, legal angle, humanity. Within the rules of war legally, the Americans were bound by the 1929 Geneva Convention to protect medical personnel. Yet Japan had not ratified that treaty. This created a one-sided situation. The U.S. was required to respect Japanese nurses as non-combatants, even though Japanese forces did not always extend the same protection. Despite this, the 10th Army insisted on full compliance. In practice, this meant Japanese medical staff were processed as prisoners of war, but treated as humanitarian cases. They received rations, delousing, and medical checks before relocation to refugee camps. In those camps, many saw captured American nurses working beside them, distributing food and tending wounds. The moral weight of such scenes was immense. At a deeper level, the chocolate bar itself became an ethical symbol. It condensed the contradiction of war, industrialized violence alongside personal decency. A single piece of candy, mass-produced by Hershey's for field rations, turned into a token of civilization surviving inside chaos. For the Americans, offering it was instinct. For the Japanese nurses, receiving it was revelation. Both sides, in that instant, recognized the other as human. Moral historians later cited these gestures as precursors to post-war humanitarian law. The occupation of Japan, launched months later, carried the same ethos: punish militarists but feed the people. The line between compassion and victory blurred. Together, these leadership, enemy, and moral angles reveal that the chocolate incident was never trivial. It represented a deliberate choice, made by generals, medics, and frightened women in caves, to act against the logic of hatred. That choice would not end the war, but it would alter how its ending was remembered. From here, the story turns toward its decisive days, the moment when the battle collapsed, the caves emptied, and surrender replaced annihilation. The turning point was not announced by radios or flags, but by silence, and by a taste of something sweet. June 1945. The southern end of Okinawa was dying. Hills had turned to ash. Streams ran red with clay and blood. The once green ridges of Hibaru and Itamen were nothing but trenches, burned trees, and shattered limestone caves. Inside those caves, hundreds of Japanese soldiers, civilians, and nurses waited for the inevitable. The Japanese 32nd Army had already disintegrated. General Ushijima's staff had destroyed their codes, burned the flags, and prepared for suicide. To the young nurses serving in field hospitals, the collapse came as whispers. The commander is dead. No reinforcements are coming. The enemy is everywhere. At the same time, U.S. forces tightened the noose. Marines and Army infantry pushed south from Shuri Castle toward the final Japanese pockets. They had orders to clear every cave, but also to protect civilians. Civil affairs teams followed close behind with translators, medical kits, and food. One of those caves, documented later in U.S. after-action reports, was the Hibaru Field Hospital, buried under the slope of a low ridge near the sea. Inside were over 100 wounded soldiers, 20 medical orderlies, and at least 15 nurses, most between 17 and 21 years old. They had been living underground for weeks. The smell of decay was unbearable. Water had run out. They could hear flamethrowers roaring outside. The nurses' commander, a middle-aged surgeon, gave them grenades. "For when they come," he said quietly. But not all obeyed. A few hid the grenades behind crates. When American voices echoed near the entrance, the nurses clutched each other and prayed. A platoon from the U.S. 7th Division approached cautiously. The cave mouth was marked with a red cross, perhaps genuine, perhaps a trap. 2 corpsmen moved forward with flashlights and white cloths. Behind them, riflemen waited. Then a sound, crying. Not the sharp, panicked scream of soldiers, soft, broken sobs. The medics lowered their weapons and stepped inside. What they saw defied every image painted by wartime propaganda. Rows of wounded Japanese soldiers lay in silence, barely breathing. Around them, the nurses, filthy, skeletal, eyes hollow from sleeplessness, raised their hands in surrender. None resisted. None attacked. The medics did what they had been trained to do. They cut open their aid packs, handed out canteens, and distributed K-rations. Inside each box was a small chocolate bar wrapped in wax paper. The gesture was simple, almost automatic, an act drilled into men who'd seen too much death. But for the nurses, it was incomprehensible. One survivor, decades later, recalled, "We thought they were pretending, that after we ate they would shoot us, but they smiled. I had not seen a man smile in months." That day, instead of execution, the nurses were led into daylight for the first time in weeks. They were escorted to a triage tent behind American lines, where doctors cleaned their wounds and gave them food. For many, the first swallow of chocolate became a moment of emotional collapse. Some cried uncontrollably, others simply stared, unable to speak. The Americans recorded the event as routine. In official notes, it was described as processing of non-combatant medical staff. Nothing in the paperwork mentioned emotion, but for those who witnessed it, the memory remained haunting. A Marine corporal later told a war correspondent, "They looked like ghosts. I didn't think they were even real until one smiled." That cave at Hibaru became emblematic of what was happening all across southern Okinawa. As the front dissolved, dozens of similar surrenders occurred. Student nurses, medical aides, mothers with infants. Many emerged carrying white flags made from bandages. In every case, the first contact followed the same pattern. Medics kneeling, offering water, then food, then chocolate. It wasn't sentimentality. It was method. Commanders had learned that fear could trigger suicides, but kindness could save lives. Within days, the number of voluntary surrenders multiplied. Even hardened Japanese officers began releasing wounded personnel instead of ordering mass death. By mid-June, the battle was over in all but name. The last defensive line at Hill 89 collapsed. General Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide on June 22, 1945. With that, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa ended. What remained were scattered survivors, and the slow, painful transition from war to recovery. In the ruins of Heibaru, American medics continued to find cave hospitals. Some contained only bodies. Others held the living clinging to fragments of belief. A few of the nurses taken prisoner there would later testify at war crimes trials, identifying the officers who had ordered them to die. But none forgot the strange taste that marked their survival. The waxy, bittersweet flavor of American military chocolate. To them, it was the moment the war ended, not with a gunshot or a white flag, but with an unexpected act of humanity. The event spread quietly through the ranks. Marines told each other, the nurses surrendered today. Photographers captured images of women in tattered uniforms standing beside American corpsmen. Those photographs would never appear in wartime newspapers, too gentle, too complicated for propaganda. But they survived in archives, a visual record of mercy amid fire. The story might have ended there, yet its meaning deepened in the days that followed, as those rescued nurses realized what had truly changed, their understanding of the enemy, and of themselves. The surrender at Heibaru was not an isolated miracle. Across the shattered valleys of southern Okinawa, similar scenes unfolded in the final week of June 1945. From Yonabaru to Itaman, U.S. infantry units encountered pockets of wounded soldiers, civilians and nurses emerging from caves with white cloths tied to sticks. The battles had ended, but fear had not. Every survivor still carried the same expectation. Capture meant degradation or death. Yet what met them were not punishers, but rescuers. American medics, often no older than the nurses they encountered, had learned a rhythm of approach. Hands visible, weapon lowered, chocolate first. It became a ritual of reassurance, wordless and universal. They offered chocolate or water before speaking. Then came the translation. You are safe now. At Hill 89, where the last major Japanese command post collapsed, nearly 50 nurses and medics surrendered together. Among them was a 19-year-old student named Yoshiko Iwamoto, later interviewed in post-war oral histories. She described how a Marine handed her a half-melted chocolate bar from his pocket. He said something in English I could not understand, but he smiled. I wanted to cry because I had prepared to die. For the U.S. troops, this moment was one of relief. After months of carnage, they had seen humanity reappear, fragile, alive, and feminine in a landscape of ruin. For the Japanese women, it was a collapse of everything they had been taught. Their teachers had told them Americans were monsters. Now those monsters were feeding them. The story of these surrenders spread through military channels. Civil affairs officers reported an increasing number of civilians approaching lines peacefully, often citing what they had heard from the nurses. The gesture of mercy had become viral in the pre-digital age, traveling by word of mouth across ravines and ridgelines faster than gunfire ever had. On the American side, higher command recognized its value. Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, who succeeded Buckner after his death, issued memoranda emphasizing humane treatment as both duty and tactic. Reports noted that distribution of food items, especially chocolate, tinned meat, sugar, continues to prove effective in calming surrendering groups. The simple D-ration bar, designed by Hershey's to survive tropical heat, had become an instrument of policy. There was precedent for this too. Almost a year earlier on Saipan, similar scenes had unfolded among the cliffs of Marpi Point. In July 1944, after the main fighting ended, U.S. Marines discovered hidden groups of Japanese civilians, families and medical staff who had resisted surrender out of fear. A handful of Japanese nurses, too wounded to flee, were found by American medics. One Marine lieutenant remembered handing out field rations and candy. We couldn't speak, he said later. We just showed them it was all right to live. Those early Saipan rescues became case studies for civil affairs planning before Okinawa. By 1945, entire training sessions were dedicated to methods of approach to hostile civilians. Soldiers were told, lower your weapon. Offer food. Smile if possible. In that manual, simplicity lay the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Psychological combat by compassion. The surrender of the Okinawan nurses also held an unexpected effect on Japanese holdouts. When word reached isolated units that medical women were treated kindly, more men chose surrender over suicide. American intelligence later confirmed that rumors of chocolate, water, and safety had traveled miles through underground corridors. The message was clear. The enemy was not the devil you'd been told. That realization did not end suffering. Fighting still raged on the island's southern tip. Artillery fell until June 21st. Civilians continued to die by the thousands, but something subtle shifted. The Americans began to find caves filled not only with corpses but with the living, terrified, but willing to emerge. In the last hours before the formal end of combat, a Marine patrol discovered a group of student nurses hiding near Mabuni Hill. They were covered in mud, carrying wounded classmates on stretchers made from bamboo. The Marines radioed for ambulances. Photographs taken that day show the women lined up beside jeeps, hands clasped, eyes hollow but alive. In the foreground, a corpsman kneels beside them, passing out rations. In one blurred frame, the faint outline of a chocolate bar is visible. The photo never reached the newspapers. It was too gentle for wartime propaganda, which demanded triumph or tragedy, not tenderness. But those images survived in military archives and later surfaced in museums in both Okinawa and Tokyo. They revealed the unrecorded dimension of victory, the human one. For the Japanese nurses, survival itself became an existential reckoning. Many wrote later that accepting food from the enemy was the moment they ceased to be soldiers. They were alive, but their worldview had shattered. "When I ate that chocolate," one wrote, "I felt like a child again. I realized I had been lied to." That internal transformation, the undoing of fear through a single act, was perhaps the real turning point. The guns would fall silent, but the memory of mercy would persist. It bridged two worlds that had spent years learning to hate each other. By the time the last caves were cleared, and the white flags outnumbered the rifles, the Battle of Okinawa had claimed over 200,000 lives. Yet, amid that devastation, a handful of nurses remembered something entirely different: the taste of survival, the warmth of a stranger's hand, and the unbelievable sweetness of American chocolate in a place where no sweetness should have existed. When the guns finally fell silent over Okinawa, the island was a graveyard. Villages were gone. Fields were cratered beyond recognition. In the south, the limestone caves that once hid hospitals were filled with smoke and silence. But among the ruins, the survivors, the Japanese nurses, civilians, and wounded, became living witnesses to a paradox. Their conquerors were now their caretakers. The U.S. 10th Army immediately began the enormous task of stabilization. Civil affairs teams and Army medical units fanned out across the island, establishing hundreds of refugee centers and field hospitals. The policy was explicit: treat all wounded, feed all hungry, regardless of nationality. For the first time since 1941, Japanese women in military uniform were cared for by American doctors. Captured nurses were classified as medical prisoners rather than enemy combatants. They were given food, delousing, and new clothing. Some were even asked to assist in tending other Japanese patients. This was both practical and symbolic. Practical because manpower was short. Symbolic because it redefined their identity. They were no longer soldiers of a fallen empire, but healers again. Reports from the 307th Medical Battalion described how quickly they adapted. Many nurses began working beside American staff within days of capture, translating medical terms, applying bandages, and assisting surgeries. Language barriers remained, but gestures bridged the divide. The simple act of cooperation, after years of indoctrination, was extraordinary. Food distribution became a daily ritual. Ration trucks brought tins of corned beef, hard biscuits, and chocolate. The chocolate bars, now in surplus from K-rations, became tokens of goodwill. Medics would give them to children and nurses alike. One Marine lieutenant wrote in a letter home, "Funny thing, Ma, we hand them candy like we're running a picnic, not a war. But when they smile, it feels like we're winning something bigger." Inside the refugee camps, U.S. doctors began cataloging survivors. Over 300 Japanese nurses were recorded as captured or surrendered. Some were from Army units. Others were high school volunteers pressed into service. Their health was poor. Most were malnourished and suffering from malaria, dysentery, or skin infections. Yet their recovery was swift once proper care began. Psychologically, however, healing was slower. Interviews conducted months later by U.S. intelligence officers revealed profound confusion. Many nurses spoke of guilt, for surviving, for accepting food from the enemy, for failing their comrades who had died by suicide. They also spoke of astonishment. "We were told Americans would desecrate us," one nurse said. "Instead, they washed our wounds and gave us chocolate. It was the first time I wanted to live again." For the American soldiers, the experience also left its mark. After years of brutal combat, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, the Pacific had conditioned men to dehumanize the enemy. Seeing Japanese women and civilians grateful for chocolate instead of terrified by it broke that conditioning. Many veterans later described the Okinawa rescues as the first time we saw them as people. The humane policy had strategic outcomes too. In official post-battle assessments, the U.S. Army concluded that compassionate treatment directly reduced resistance. The final weeks of the Okinawa campaign saw more than 10,000 prisoners taken alive, an unprecedented number compared to earlier Pacific battles. Many of those surrenders were traced to word-of-mouth reports from rescued medical staff and civilians. By July 1945, as the island transitioned to occupation duties, the surviving Japanese nurses were concentrated in care facilities run jointly by American and Okinawan administrators. Some were later repatriated to Japan. Others stayed to work in newly founded local hospitals. They became silent symbols of a new phase of the war, where compassion had replaced annihilation, but the trauma of what they had endured never fully faded. In later testimonies, many said that even after returning home, they could not forget the faces of the American medics, nor could they forget the taste of the chocolate that had marked their first moment of mercy. It was an aftermath defined not by treaties or speeches, but by quiet acts of rebuilding. The same hands that once fought now rebuilding life. One patient, one ration, one gesture at a time. The war officially ended 2 months later, on August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's voice trembled through the radio, announcing surrender. In Okinawa, the sound came through static-filled speakers at American command posts. For the surviving Japanese nurses, many still in field hospitals or refugee camps, it was a moment of disbelief. The empire that had demanded their deaths now told them to live. When the first Allied occupation ships anchored off Japan's coast, the lessons of Okinawa came with them. The humane procedures tested there, medical care for the enemy, respectful treatment of women, psychological stabilization through food and empathy, became the blueprint for the larger occupation of the home islands. It wasn't just policy. It was precedent written in sweat and chocolate. At refugee centers in Naha, American doctors continued to treat thousands of Okinawans. Japanese nurses, once enemies, now worked as assistants and interpreters. A few even wore borrowed U.S. medical armbands. Their tasks were simple: boiling instruments, distributing rations, recording the names of the wounded. But their presence carried immense symbolic weight. To local civilians, seeing Japanese and American medical staff side by side was the first visible sign that the war's cruelty might finally be ending. In post-war Japan, their stories slowly surfaced. During the 1950s and 1960s, survivors of the Okinawa field hospitals began giving interviews to historians and journalists. Some spoke anonymously, others publicly. Nearly all described the same moment: the taste of chocolate, the shock of survival, the collapse of propaganda. Their testimonies were brief, understated, yet deeply human. One nurse interviewed in Tokyo in 1968 recalled, "When I ate that chocolate, I realized the world was not what I had been told. I had been taught the enemy was a beast, but he treated me as a woman, as a person. It changed how I thought of everything, even Japan." American veterans told their versions too. In letters, memoirs, and oral histories, many described those moments as among the few that made the Pacific worth enduring. A Navy corpsman from the 6th Marine Division wrote, "We handed out rations to those girls. They cried like kids. That was the first time I felt the war might end someday, for real." For both sides, the memory of chocolate became shorthand for something far larger: the possibility of mercy amid total destruction. Historians examining occupation records later noted measurable results. The humane treatment of prisoners and civilians on Okinawa influenced American policy in Japan from 1945 onward. General MacArthur's headquarters issued guidelines explicitly citing Okinawa lessons when training troops for the mainland occupation. Show discipline. Avoid humiliation. Offer food and medical aid first. The approach worked. In September 1945, as U.S. soldiers entered Tokyo, there was no mass civilian resistance. Fear had already been broken, first by words, then by actions, then by something as small as a piece of chocolate. In Okinawa, memorials slowly rose. The Hibaru Army Hospital site became a museum, displaying rusted surgical tools, uniforms, and faded photographs. Among them, one relic stands out: a preserved American D-ration chocolate wrapper, found in the ruins after the war. It is displayed behind glass today, brittle and brown with age. The caption reads simply, "Given to a captured nurse by an American soldier, June 1945. Visitors stand before it quietly. There are no political slogans, no flags, just a reminder that even in the darkest moment of human conflict, compassion can survive." For the surviving nurses, life after the war was not easy. Many faced stigma in Japan, accused of dishonor for surrendering. Some never spoke of their experiences again. Others became advocates for peace, visiting schools to tell children that the enemy they once feared had been kind. In doing so, they carried forward an unintentional legacy of reconciliation. In interviews recorded before their deaths, several said the same thing, that when the world seemed to have lost all humanity, it was a single gesture, a shared ration, a small square of bitter chocolate, that proved humanity could return. And so, amid statistics of 200,000 dead in cities turned to dust, one small memory endured, passed from survivors to historians to visitors who still stand in front of that fragile wrapper, wondering how something so ordinary could mean so much. History remembers Okinawa for its horror: the firestorms, the mass suicides, the annihilation of an island caught between two empires. Yet, beneath the smoke and ruins, there was another history, quieter, smaller, and far more human. It did not unfold in strategy rooms or on victory decks, but in muddy fields and ruined caves, in the trembling hands of a nurse and the outstretched hand of a medic. In that single exchange, a rationed bar of chocolate shared between enemies, the Pacific War briefly lost its cruelty. It revealed that even after years of propaganda, starvation, and hate, compassion could still survive. No speeches, no orders, just instinct. A man who refused to kill when he could have. A woman who accepted kindness when she was certain she would die. Their moment did not change the course of the battle, but it changed what that battle meant. It became a seed of memory carried through generations, proof that mercy can exist inside the machinery of total war. Decades later, historians and veterans would speak of Okinawa not only as the last great bloodletting of the Pacific, but as the first moment of reconciliation. The nurses who survived went on to rebuild hospitals, teach new students, raise families. Some kept the chocolate wrapper for years, a fragile relic of the day they met humanity again. In the great scale of war, such gestures seem invisible. Yet history often turns on invisible things: the courage to offer, the humility to accept. That afternoon in June 1945, when a trembling nurse bit into a piece of foreign chocolate and realized she would live, the Pacific War briefly paused. In that silence, the world glimpsed what peace might feel like. No official monument marks that instant. No general's report captured it fully. But for those who were there, the sweetness of that moment outlasted the bitterness of war. And in that small act, one soldier's mercy, one nurse's tears, the human heart proved itself stronger than empire, stronger than ideology, and strong enough to begin again. The Pacific War was filled with cruelty, but moments like this remind us that compassion can survive even in hell. If stories like these move you, subscribe to keep history alive, one true story at a time. Subscribe for more untold World War II stories that reveal the humanity behind the headlines.